The alliance between America and Europe has been shaken, if not destroyed. This is going to transform Europe into a rival superpower to the United States of America. One of the signature prophecies of Herbert W. Armstrong is being fulfilled before your eyes. We're going to look at this and more on today's Trumpet World Week in Review.
Many Americans don't have a clue about how violently our allies are condemning our foreign policy because, well, we're just not interested here in America very much in foreign policy. We have other local things that we're interested in, but we better get interested in foreign policy because, let me tell you, the rest of the world is very interested in it.
Welcome back to the Trumpet World Week in Review show, where we show how the news that you see every day comes straight from the pages of your Bible. We point you back to Bible-based forecasts from Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, the founder of the Plain Truth magazine, and Mr. Gerald Flurry, editor-in-chief of The Trumpet, the host of the Key of David show. And we show you how these forecasts are coming to life before your eyes. And a lot of the news this week revolves around America's foreign policy decisions, something that at least those in the United States are typically not so interested in. And these are some big stories and very important prophetic developments that we're seeing from this. So the Munich Security Conference last weekend will be a major milestone for Europe. We've been watching the prophesied break between Europe and America happen in front of us. And JD Vance's speech has been talked about a lot. It kind of went out right about the same time as this show was going up on YouTube. He was very critical of a lot of things about Europe. Here's an idea of some of what he said. This is clip 2.
I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. But what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being considered.
I think these are great points. But European leaders really didn't like this message. And you saw this at the conference. He had very little applause during that speech. And then the Chinese foreign minister who came on right after him, they loved him. They gave him all kinds of applause. But the European elites didn't like to hear that. And we've been saying many of these same points, perhaps less eloquently than he put it, on this show for years. Europe is shifting away from democracy, away from freedom of speech. European leaders, though, they also did not like being told that Europe's not good, or that the United States is not going to pay for their defense anymore. They were really unhappy at this message. And here's what Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, a man that we've been watching for a long time, he was on MSNBC kind of giving a European perspective to this speech. Here's a bit of a flavor of what he said.
We are all puzzled, Anna. It's a messaging that changes almost on an hourly basis. Over the last few days, we were all quite surprised by the call that the president had with Vladimir Putin, and then especially by the fact that his newly appointed Secretary of Defense is obviously taking negotiation tokens off the table. So, and all of these things without having the European allies and partners somehow included. So there is confusion is probably the mildest word I can find for that. we are definitely not prepared to balance the current or the existing American security umbrella for Europe. It would take years to come to a level where we could feel as secure as we need to be. And on the other hand, of course, Trump has a point, and as had already Joe Biden and others before that the Europeans need to ramp up their security measures, and we need to do more without a question. However, in that situation right now, to question core elements of NATO, of the alliance, and of our shared security is reckless. We are in a new world right now in that regard. Europe is prepared. Europe has potential counter tariffs, but just imagine a world where we would slide into a trade war of that dimension. So this is nothing anyone would like to have, and the repercussions for the US might also be severe. So I think that's something the president has not taken into account so far. But if we are forced as Europeans to react, we will react, but that's not the world I'd like to live in.
I think confused is an interesting euphemism, really. They were angry. They didn't like what they heard. He himself said it was a mild term. And then you got a bit of a veiled threat at the end there. We're preparing for a trade war. We're prepared. We can make it hurt. So Europe is not at all happy with what they've heard from the United States this week. But I think America should also take a warning from JD Vance. And perhaps JD Vance himself needs to take a warning from his words. Here's another clip from his speech.
But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within. Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. He warned that if things don't go to plan, the very same thing could happen in Germany too. Now, these cavalier statements are shocking to American ears. For years, we've been told that everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values. Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is billed as a defense of democracy. But when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I say ourselves because I fundamentally believe that we are on the same team.
And think about what he's saying here. He is saying democracy is under attack in Europe. Free speech is under attack in Europe. He said in the earlier clip, democracy cannot survive what they're doing in Germany and Europe. And he said, well, they're cancelling elections. You're doing things that aren't in the name of our shared democratic value. But after all of that, he still says, well, I fundamentally believe we're on the same team. He was pushing for Europe to spend more on their military. And the US Defense Secretary was over there pushing for Europe to spend more on their military. I mean, think about how much the United States trusts Europe. And this is a point Mr. Fleury has made time and time again. I mean, they even trust Europe with nuclear bombs. And here's a clip from a Key of David program about 15 years ago or so, maybe more, where Mr. Fleury was talking about this.
According to Time magazine, Europe has a dirty nuclear bomb secret. Now, I believe they're right, and I think most of our viewers would probably think, well, if there's going to be a dangerous nuclear arsenal, it would be in Russia or Iran in the Middle East or China or North Korea. But I can prove to you, I believe, that the most dangerous nuclear arsenal is in Europe. Now, you don't hear very much about that, but do you know that the U.S. has nuclear bombs in Germany, for example, who started both world wars and even started a war in 1870 that took control of half of France? So they have a history of doing that. Also, we have nuclear bombs in Italy. They were our enemy in World War II. So is it wise for us to be doing this, having our nuclear arms there? And there's a lot more to it than just that is, I think, very mind-chilling.
So America's trusted this power with nuclear bombs. And JD Vance is up there warning, hey, you don't share our values, democracy can't survive what you're doing. That should be a much more bigger shaking wake-up call than I think even Mr. Vance is treating it. There's a massive warning there about America is trusting this power that fundamentally has different values, different views of the world. And this is what they had a really good article this week. It's time for Europe to do the unthinkable. That really exposes what Europe's thinking there. And that article, it says desperate times must call for desperate measures. Europe must do the unthinkable, and it lays out a series of points. First, Europe should announce its willingness to quit NATO. A Europe that is forced to spend 5% on defense, 5% of its economy, is a Europe that doesn't need the United States. It goes on to talk about, well, if you look at a Europe, including the UK, she puts that in there, this author, that spends 5% of its GDP on its military, that's $1 trillion. That's way more than the United States currently spends. And Donald Trump is talking about halving US defense spending and having some kind of deal with Russia and China where he cuts that in half. Which, I mean, can you imagine a world where Europe spends $1 trillion on its defense and America spends half that? That's a big shift. That is pushing Europe to become a military superpower. That is pushing Europe to have a military the size and capability of the United States. And as JD Vance is really saying, well, we can't trust Europe. Well, if you can't trust Europe, why push for them to have that kind of scale military? It then goes on to say, this article, if Metternich or Talleyrand or Charles de Gaulle were alive today, they would recommend unthinkable option number 2, work out a new grand strategic bargain with Russia. And there's a lot of history there, and we'll talk about that more in just a little bit, but Europe, Germany, working out a grand strategic bargain with Russia, splitting the world between Russia and Europe, that's what Foreign Policy, this very well-respected magazine, is advising Europe do. Continuing in this article, this leads to unthinkable option number 3, work out a new strategic compact with China. And it basically goes on to say, well, you look at China's geography, America's geography, China is a growing naval power in the Pacific Ocean. Yeah, it makes sense for China and America to be adversaries over who's going to dominate the Pacific. But what's that got to do with Europe? America can be China's adversary, but we could be close friends with them. And all of these points are precisely what Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Fleury have talked about for years. Europe allying itself with Russia, breaking with the US, allying itself with China. I mean, we have a booklet, China's Most Dangerous Move Against America, that talks about what China and Europe are going to be able to do to America working together. And that is a massive shift. And you have elections coming up in Germany just this weekend. And The Spectator had an article there saying Germany's next chancellor has a real opportunity to do what Schulz promised and never delivered, to create a strong, fighting-fit Germany in the center of Europe. That's what Donald Trump is pushing for and JD Vance is pushing for. And this isn't about taking sides or condemning particular politicians. This is about pointing out what the Bible says. I think it's very understandable I think it's very understandable the United States wanting Europe to shoulder more of the burden of defending the Western world. But pushing Europe to become a military superpower is dangerous. There would be other ways, I'm sure, of having that burden divided. But what we're watching here is a critical Bible prophecy that the US and Britain would depend on foreign allies, that they would look to these foreign allies and that these foreign allies would betray us. And here's another clip from a Key of David with Mr. Fleury describing this prophecy.
In the late 70s, Germany was considered one of America's very best friends, if not the best. And yet today, if you ask the German people, 85% of them will tell you that they have a negative view of America. Now, the Bible does talk about them being our lovers, and we have literature that will explain that to you. And they became our lovers, let's say, after World War II, when we really had a lot to do with defeating them. And then we spent billions and billions of dollars to rebuild Germany and bring them back into the, let's say, the civilized world. Germany started World War I and World War II, and the Bible prophesies that they're going to start World War III, and all of that's going to lead directly into the second coming of Jesus Christ. Christ is going to have to stop it because of all the weapons of mass destruction.
And this is the dynamic you see right now. Europe doesn't like the US. They've turned against them so much. In the US, okay, yep, JD Vance, they're offering some criticism of Europe. But America's still loaning them nuclear bombs. They're encouraging them to develop their military. They're still saying, well, we view the EU as being on the same team. Like, you can see Europe getting ready to betray the United States, and you can see the United States still trusting their foreign lovers. It's going to lead to a colossal betrayal. And I played a similar clip on the show last week, but I think it provides just some critical biblical truth and prophetic dimension to what is happening here. But here's Mr. Armstrong talking about this soon coming betrayal. This is clip 9.
Thou shalt love the eternal thy God with all your mind and heart and soul and strength. That's the first and great commandment. We violate that as a nation. Now, I don't think we realize we're doing it. I don't think we do at all. I think we sincerely think. We've just kidded ourselves into thinking. We've been deceived into believing that we're really relying on God. But then, you know, we think that God is sort of a myth, and he's far off, and maybe he's not real, and maybe he couldn't really help us. So we must depend on something that is real. We must depend on something that we can see. And so now we're so afraid of Russia that the United States government feels that it must take what we call a calculated risk, you know, and try to build up Germany and Central Europe against Russia.
And it's a calculated risk. So many will acknowledge God saved Donald Trump's life. They saw that turn of the head. He wasn't assassinated. That God intervened to bring him back to the White House. You know, that Mr. Flurry said he's going to come back when it looked impossible, and he's back. You know, you can see God speaking through his man and backing that up. God working in this world. So, okay, are we going to trust God then? If we believe that God does intervene in world events like that, well, then he can save us. We can trust him. Are we going to turn to him and ask for help instead of looking to Europe, looking to Germany for help? That's really the only solution. I think we can talk about pros and cons of different man-made solutions, but there are no man-made solutions. God is bringing us to the point where it's just that simple choice. Are we going to trust God or trust in man? And he's showing that trusting in man cannot and does not work. And we do have a lot of material taking you through more of those prophecies about these lovers that will turn on the United States. Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry had an article this week. JD Vance exposes Europe's break from America. If you want to know more about this subject, I would really encourage you to read that article. And he takes you through those lovers' prophecies that I've alluded to and shows you how this dependence on Europe and then Europe's betrayal, that is prophesied in your Bible. And that is what we're seeing. And we also have German elections this weekend. I think that's really important to keep in mind. And you do have this sense of crisis mode. Europe has depended on the United States for their protection for so long. And the US has had very little thanks for that. But that protection now, it's being lifted. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to rapidly rearm. We already mentioned that a few weeks ago where you had a factory being closed down and they're now reopening it to make tanks. And I'm seeing more and more people talking about this now. Like, well, Germany has this industrial crisis. You've never had a VW plant closed down in Germany in like 50, 60 years, but there's a couple of plants, I think maybe even 3, they're looking at closing. Well, people are talking about, well, we need to rearm. We don't want to close factories. Can we shift? Can we make tanks instead of cars? Can we make armored personnel carriers instead of cars? And you're going to see this more and more. And I think one more thing that's worth considering in the context of this big turnaround is that the Pope's been very sick this week. He's been in hospital in pneumonia in both lungs. He doesn't even have that much left of one lung from an earlier sickness. And there have been reports saying, well, the Pope thinks that it's the end, that he's been getting ready to hand everything over. that the Swiss Guard have been practicing for the Pope's funeral. The last day or two, things have been saying, well, it's been maybe looking up a bit. Don't know exactly when he might die, but he is older, he is sickly. And Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Fleury have always talked about the massive role that the Catholic Church will play in the rise of this European power. And here's just a flavor of one radio broadcast from Mr. Armstrong.
Now, ever since the nations in Europe have wanted to reunite, and I've been foretelling it, the Bible foretells it, just as I did foretell World War II, now I'm foretelling World War III. People scoffed, they didn't believe it then, it happened. Some people may be scoffing today, it will happen. And you can bet your life on that because you are betting your life on it. Now, why has it not come sooner? Why has it been so long? And I have known it was coming for 50 years now. Well, in Europe, they are divided by different language barriers. There's so many different languages. For example, there is German, English, Spanish, French, Italian, Greek, many different languages. They have various national aspirations that divide them, national patriotisms. And of course, they are always competitive. Then they have various currencies and monetary systems. And all of those things tend to divide them. Now, always in the so-called Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church was the sort of cementing agent that cemented the nations together and brought them together religiously. And Bible prophecy says will be once again. The nations cannot get together politically all by themselves.
So this transformation in Europe is going to happen very, very quickly. The US is pushing Germany to rearm. You're going to see elections in Germany that will lead to the rise of a strong German leader. And our show on Wednesday, we were just focused on watching those German elections. So if you want to know more about what to watch for in the run-up to those elections, you can go back and look at that show. The Pope is on his sickbed. We could have a new Pope that might really know the German financial system or the economic system that Mr. Fleury's talked about and really help bring that strong man to power. All of this is coming together really quickly. And we have I mentioned that article, JD Vance Exposes Europe's Break from America. We have a free booklet as well, The Holy Roman Empire in Prophecy, that you can go to our website, thetrumpet.com. You can read it online. You can order your own free print copy, study that, look at what Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Fleury have been saying for years, and understand, prove what they've been saying from the Bible, and watch for that Bible prophecy to be fulfilled before your eyes. I wanted to bring Jeremiah and Asia into the discussion, but to introduce that, I want to play one more clip from Mr. Armstrong on another major motivation for Europe to unite and to transform into this massive, dominating military power.
Now, one of the great things that is urging Europe on, and perhaps the greatest thing that will cause them to hurry and get together on this, is their fear of what's going on in the Kremlin and the Soviet Union. And Andropov is frightening them. And that is going to rush them. They are losing confidence in the United States as having a military umbrella over them to protect them. And they want their own military force to protect themselves. That's the way they feel over there. Now, that is a chief incentive to unite them, and that is taking place.
Now, I think he was talking there during the 1980s, but that is a prophesied dynamic. That's something that took, I think, a big leap forwards this week. And to tell us more about it, we're joined now by Jeremiah Jacques.
Yes, that's an excellent introduction, I think, because the big story right now is that the Russians are rejoicing over the stance that the Trump administration is taking toward Russia's war against Ukraine. So most of the celebration that we're seeing right now is coming from Russian propagandists, those who work for RT and Sputnik and outlets such as that. They just could not be more delighted by Mr. Trump's recent direction. But even among some of the high-ranking officials, we're also seeing the champagne bottles really being opened up this week. Dmitry Medvedev, he's a close ally to Vladimir Putin, also the former president of Russia. And he said on Wednesday, if you had told me just 3 months ago that these were the words of the U.S. president, I would have laughed out loud. end quote. So Medvedev is taking a really triumphant tone there, and so is Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He praised the way President Trump understands the Kremlin's point of view. And it's not hard to see why these Putin cronies are just over the moon right now. They have just heard the President of the United States of America blame Ukraine for starting the war that they started. You know, that kind of absurdity is normally the exclusive domain of the Kremlin. But here is the POTUS parroting their nonsense. Russian officials have also heard this week Trump and his officials just kind of dogpiling onto the Ukrainian leadership with some really puzzling statements, some false statements. President Trump said the U.S. has outspent Europe by $200 billion in terms of money given to help Ukraine defend itself. Anyone can do the math and see that that's not even remotely true. That figure isn't even the total that America has spent, or that's higher than the total that the U.S. has spent. So very puzzling there. And then President Trump also said Ukraine's president has a 4% approval rating. Just a really bizarre, demonstrably false statement. This was all part of Mr. Trump's screed against Ukrainian President Zelensky, calling him a dictator for not holding elections, even though that's stipulated by Ukraine's constitution. And it's pretty standard for nations to delay elections when they're being pulverized by a foreign invader.
Right.
You can look to World War II Britain, you know, for a notable example of that.
Yeah, I think, Britain canceled elections, and Britain, like Ukraine is under more pressure than Britain was during World War II, I think, arguably. Like, we canceled elections. There was no part of the United Kingdom that was under foreign occupation. There weren't Russian soldiers in Kent. But we still said we can't hold an election under these conditions, and the election was delayed until Nazi Germany was defeated. So, I mean, it feels very hard to see how Ukraine could hold an election under these circumstances and have it be free and fair and no coercion. And I mean, it seems like an election in Ukraine at this point could very easily be an open door for Russia to manipulate regions under their control and turn things around, perhaps even for the whole country.
That's a very good point. And I think it's also very telling that Volodymyr Zelensky's opposition, leaders such as Poroshenko, who loathe Zelensky, they hate him. But they still say, well, no, right now, obviously, Ukraine can't hold elections, and Zelensky should remain in power right now until we can, have some stability. So I think that that's very notable that even opposition figures are puzzled by this, by this statement from Trump. And also, if you don't like dictators, as Trump appears to be saying here, it seems like Putin may be the guy that you would unleash some of your criticisms on. But we haven't heard any criticism at all of Putin from Trump. So very perplexing. And I do think that President Trump has some legitimate reasons for disliking Zelensky. Zelensky should have been more supportive, could have been more supportive of Trump during his first term. And there are questions about Zelensky's dealings with the Bidens as well. But Mr. Trump didn't really address any of those legitimate concerns in his diatribes this week. Instead, it was honestly just bewildering and embarrassing, just full of so many false statements. And I think that perhaps even more important than those diatribes was the Trump administration announcing that America and Russia have restored normal functioning of each other's diplomatic missions. So that's part of Trump's outreach to Putin and part of his negotiations with Putin. The final plan is for Trump to give big parts of Ukraine to Russia in order to kind of satisfy Russia. And of course, that's a major win for Russia. And then if all of that were not enough, President Trump also threatened America's European allies this week, telling them that they better go along with his and Putin's plan for Ukraine's surrender, or else the U.S. will pull troops out of Europe. We don't know how many troops, but the details kind of don't matter, because this kind of statement from America's leader just severely undercuts NATO. They show the Europeans that America is no longer any sort of ally to rely on, and it severely weakens NATO. And of course, a weak NATO is the best thing imaginable for President Putin and his cronies. The Russians don't want anyone to be able to stand up against their expansionism. So they love seeing President Trump trashed NATO. And I think that that's exactly what, it goes along with what we just heard there from Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong talking about the Europeans feeling that they are no longer under the military umbrella of the United States. Here's President Trump directly threatening, if you don't go along with this plan of mine and Putin's, you will not be under our security umbrella. And the Russians are delighted. That means no one will be able to stand up to them when they go into Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Moldova, perhaps the Baltics next, who knows? So anyway, it has been a very big week, a very confusing week for many Americans and Europeans. And it's not hard to see why the Russians are rejoicing about these developments.
I think there's a lot we could follow up on. I think one thing that's particularly concerning to me is how much this seems to be taking Kremlin talking points at face value. And for example, as well, I don't think you mentioned it, but this idea that Zelensky started the war, like that the war is Zelensky's fault, which, I mean, we were doing Trumpet Hour back when the war started, and we had multiple episodes where we were all sitting around and we're like, okay, Jeremiah, is Vladimir Putin going to invade this week? And you would kind of say, well, yes or no, or what he's got the thought to calculate, but it all revolved around what is Vladimir Putin going to do? There was no question of Zelensky being the one starting the war. Now, you take a longer term view, and yeah, there is a potentially more nuanced picture of NATO moving into Russia's backyard and Russia feeling in the early 19s that they got a commitment that NATO wouldn't expand, that being violated, NATO going in and breaking up Yugoslavia. So, like, there is a more nuanced long-term picture that we can talk about, but none of that involves Zelensky. Like, that still wouldn't justify saying, well, Zelensky started that war. So you've got a number of things that are just provably, demonstrably untrue. And I think also, like, okay, again, like the issue of war and peace, and should we negotiate a peace for Ukraine? You can make a case, I think, that this war has gone on, that in the long run, Ukraine cannot hold out against Russia, and they should quit while they're ahead and maybe come to some kind of deal like Finland did ahead of World War II when they were invaded by the Soviet Union, and they give up a minimal amount of territory. And, well, that's better than fighting on for another several years and potentially being completely defeated. There are arguments for negotiating a peace. But Donald Trump isn't just doing that. He's going beyond kind of making the case for a negotiated settlement, and it's full on adopting and basically trusting and seeming to believe Vladimir Putin and what he says and his perspective of the war. And I think that's where it ties right in with what we were talking about last week as well, about, well, Donald Trump has said that he trusts Vladimir Putin, and I think what we've seen this week is proof of that. Like, he's trusting the Kremlin's worldview.
It's a very good point. And back in 2023, Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry actually wrote about what it means to trust leaders such as Vladimir Putin. And he actually pointed to a verse in Daniel chapter 4 that says these kinds of rulers, such as Putin, are so power-crazed and so inhumane that they have the mind basically of a beast. That's the biblical language used there. And then Mr. Flurry just excoriated President Trump for thinking that he could make peace and make a deal and see eye to eye with and become friends with a leader like that. In one section of this article, he writes, Mr. Trump believes he could negotiate with Vladimir Putin, giving him sections of Ukraine and expecting this to pacify him. That reveals a total lack of comprehension about who he is dealing with. And then he continues on from there. He writes, President Trump said that Putin is a man that he got along really well with. Is that true? Is that wise? Should anyone get along with an evil man like the Prince of Russia? Can God get along with the devil? End quote. So there is Mr. Fleury's assessment of these kinds of outreaches to Putin and what it means to parrot Kremlin talking points, a really scathing condemnation of that kind of peace plan and that kind of thinking. And I think a lot of us were optimistic in some ways when President Trump came into power a month ago today. We were optimistic about a reprieve from the moral bankruptcy of the Biden administration. But now we've seen President Trump pressure Israel into accepting an appalling deal with Hamas. And now to that, we can add these overtures to Russia and to Vladimir Putin, and this apparent full surrender to Russia, and also these, kind of attacks on U.S. allies that come along with it. And it all paints a very grim picture. And for anyone who would like to understand all of that in the prophetic context, I would encourage you to read that article that I just quoted above from Mr. Fleury. It's called "The Ukraine War Will Not Start World War III."
And just to whet your appetite for that, we did... I don't think we even got to these last week. I put together just a montage as well from a Key of David program a few years before of what Mr. Fleury had said about Vladimir Putin.
U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump said on July 31st, 2015, "I think I would just get along very well with Vladimir Putin." Now let me show you what is going to happen to people who get close to that kind of a person and get close to, let's say, getting along with them very well. What happens when we get closer and closer to Putin? We get further and further away from God. That's what these verses are saying. That's deadly dangerous. Where is God? We get further and further away from God and closer to Vladimir Putin so he can prey upon us. And that's what he will do. That's all he knows to do. And he'll do it.
I mean, I talked about how, well, there's one thing to kind of have this almost balance of power approach and, okay, well, he's evil, but we'll do business with him. I think as Mr. Fleury points out in the quotes that you read from and from that video, there's great danger even in that approach of getting close to someone like Vladimir Putin and underestimating the evil. And certainly that I'm glad you brought out about Daniel chapter 4 and the great degree that's evil there. But again, this goes even further than that in kind of supporting, endorsing, getting friendly with someone that is that evil. But I think some of the other stories, or at least one of the other stories you had to bring us today, also just underscored that level of evil that we're seeing.
That's right. Yes, I had a couple of small ones. And the first one is just a heartbreaking report about Russia torturing female prisoners of war. This was in the Telegraph on Thursday, and we've already heard many of these kinds of reports about Russia torturing the men that it captures. But this new report interviewed women who had finally been released from Russian captivity, and they had never been soldiers. These were just civilians who were captured. And it details all kinds of depraved actions that their Russian captors took, including rape, severe beatings, and cattle prod shocks, and so much else. So these are, it's really just the latest in a long list of war crimes being systematically committed by Putin's forces. And when you hear reports like these, you see what Mr. Fleury means by Putin's satanic policies. I think that was part of the quote that we just heard from him, satanic policies. And you see why he's condemning, negotiating with, and appeasing a kind of man like Vladimir Putin so resolutely. And then one other quick story here about China smuggling Western components to Russia in order to keep Russia's war machine humming, and so that the Russians can keep on terrorizing civilians and torturing prisoners of war, male and female alike, and just committing all kinds of other horrendous war crimes. So this is from a new report by rearmament, and it produces evidence showing that around 80% of Russia's Western drone components now come from China. So 80% of these components that have become so important in the war effort, they're being routed through China. It usually happens with covert transfers and generally through private companies. And these are extremely significant quantities of these drone components. So China claims, very ludicrously, to be neutral in this war, but it is firmly in the Russian camp and has done all it can for the last 3 years to help the Russians keep on fighting. So it's just more evidence that while many in the West try to isolate Russia, Asia stands with Putin, China very staunchly, North Korea even to the point of sending troops to fight with Russia, and others like India in a more nuanced way at this point. But this all shows that even before the U.S. started to try to make its apparent surrender to Russia, the Russians had some powerful friends. And those friends are a big part of the reason why the war is still raging after almost 3 years.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jeremiah. And that article, The Ukraine War Will Not Start World War III, we will have a link to that in our show notes. That's I think another it's relevant, again, as we have Donald Trump now in office, and trying to negotiate this deal. And I mean, like you say, I think that article also talks about the European dimension that we've been discussing here as well, and the way that Europe's no longer being under America's protection. Well, that's going to cause them a whole lot of fear, and that is going to cause them to beef up their militaries and also come to their own accommodation, their own negotiation with Russia. Mr. Flo's long speculated that Germany has their own deal with Russia. And I think that's another part of this deadly danger of Donald Trump negotiating with Putin is Germany and Russia have probably already done a deal to betray the United States. So Donald Trump is not negotiating with a partner who's negotiating in good faith. He's, I think, already working and plotting against the United States. That's certainly, I think, very clear. So, we saw more evidence of that this week, where France and Britain wanted to come up with a new peace plan to send soldiers to Ukraine, and Germany very dramatically, very quickly pulled the plug. The Chancellor even said he was irritated by the idea, thought it was totally premature, was very blunt in dismissing it, because Germany doesn't want to go anywhere down that route. They've already agreed that they're going to give Ukraine to Russia. So a dangerous negotiation partner. And it's also been a hard week for Israel. We've had some dramatic attempted bus bombings that were thwarted that could have killed a whole lot more people. But also we got some tragic news about some of the hostages taken prisoner on October 7th. And so to hear more about that, we'll get an update from Mihailo Zekic.
Yes, so the big story is that yesterday Israel got back the bodies of the Bibas family. Shiri Bibas, a 32-year-old woman, at least when she was abducted, and her two sons, Ariel and Kafir. Ariel was 4 years old, and Kafir, which we're seeing on the footage right now, was 9 months when he was abducted. That's the father there. He was abducted separately and released alive separately, actually earlier this month. Hamas, for their part, claimed that they actually died back in November 2023 in an Israeli airstrike. Israel never confirmed that. And to bring in about Hamas lying, they've also lied about Israel killing people with their own strikes before, when in reality they've killed people. For all intents and purposes, they have been murdered by Hamas one way or another. And I think, well, aside from the fact that obviously it is a progression in the ceasefire negotiations, which we've talked about quite a bit, I think a lot of the public has sort of forgotten in general just how brutal Hamas is with treating them as like, okay, there's October 7th was over a year ago now. At this point, it's a much different dynamic. Those three coffins, and there was also another dead hostage, I should also mention, Oded Lifshitz, an 88-year-old man who wasn't related. Those show you just who Hamas is and what they stand for. When you look at them handing back the remains of a dead 9-month-old baby, that gives you a pretty good picture on what from the river to the sea Palestine will be free looks like. And this is important in the sense that this week we've heard also that the ceasefire phase 2 negotiations have started as well. The Israeli government is apparently going ahead with that. And who knows how that's going to turn out.
And those pictures of a happy baby, and they're hard to watch, just knowing what horrors he had to endure, and that this is a group that went in and deliberately kidnapped women, children, babies, that they kidnapped or that they killed a lot of babies on October 7th. I think you're right. Like, we forget how horrific even the events of October 7th were. And we don't want to think about those. But there is a horrific evil there that we need to be aware of for a number of reasons. But Mr. Fleury talked about this evil just right after October 7th and what Hamas is capable of. And this is what he said about that.
What is happening in Jerusalem and the cities of Judah? Certainly the most shocking event, to me anyhow, has been the beheading of 40 Jewish babies. And what must God think about this? What does he say about it? And he has a lot to say about it. So we should be concerned about what God thinks on something like this. And certainly This is not about any political view, but this is about a biblical view. What does God say about this? We don't hear much of that. What is it that we need to understand? I'll tell you, there are numerous Bible verses that talk to you about this subject, and God even gets so far as to punish people very severely for this kind of act and this kind of vile problem that should not be done by any political party or anybody else. It's certainly not something that I'm talking about politically. But I know from Bible prophecy that it's going to get worse and worse, and you can look into the prophecies of the Bible and see that clearly. And God says He will protect His people if they're obedient, but 95% of God's own people are prophesied to go into the Great Tribulation and lose their babies. Can you believe that?
This is something that God feels strongly about, and that there will be in time His justice for that. He's not going to leave the people behind this unpunished.
I think probably to be frank, most macabre and creepy aspects of everything that went on with the Bibas family is that for the past several weeks, whenever hostages are released, Hamas has one last moment of gloating where they bring them up on the stage and present them with a certificate of their captivity as a bit of a mockery. And of course, the hostages have to stand there smiling if they don't want to get shot or sent back or whatever. They did the same thing with these dead bodies. Thankfully, we didn't actually see any physical bodies there, but they had the coffins of everybody on the stage. They had the face of who was in the coffin. You could see the picture of the 9-month-old baby in a coffin with jihadi fighters and their balaclavas and their headbands with their guns, yeah, and like the Arabic music blasting around and like crowds going to watch them. They were parading the bodies of children on stage for the whole world to see before sending them off to the Red Cross, etc., who were there for the spectacle, so to speak. And the fact that they're able to do, it shows that they're very unrepentant, even if they like to try and hide blame or whatever as much as possible. They're pretty happy with what happened still. But also it shows that they're not backing down. They're not in a position of weakness. They're in a position where if they could do it, they'd do that over again.
And there's all the people in the West that cheer Hamas, that have been celebrating Hamas. And they're responsible. They're accountable. And ultimately, this is a devil-inspired act to murder babies like this. But this is what Mr. Flurry said again about this in that same Key of David.
This is satanic to the core. Satan is a liar and a murderer from the beginning. He loves to murder people, and especially little babies, because it's so shocking. This is what we're talking about. If you look at the Bible, and if you look at God's view, that's what it is. And then last weekend we had something like a global jihad where tens of thousands of people were praising what Hamas had done, these terrorists had done. Now again, that happened, I'm sure, from both parties and various people. What is God going to think about those people, maybe hundreds of thousands of them, who would be celebrating the death of 40 beheaded Jewish little babies? What does God think about that? We do if we're concerned about the Bible or concerned about what the Bible thinks. And God says, well, He really is going to punish that, the people that do that. What do you think God, if you just look at it spiritually, that would surely tell you a lot, but what would God think about people who, let's say, who didn't do that act themselves, but were rejoicing about it? Well, He would certainly, as I understand this, He would certainly hold them guilty as well. Isn't that the way God would look at this spiritually? When you think about His view of all these things, if we're concerned about the Bible and what God has to say.
And this story exposes this is Satan's world. There's a great evil out there. I mean, like we say, God rules in the kingdom of men. God is more powerful than Satan. God allows this to happen, but God has allowed Satan to have control of this world, and he's doing some evil things with it. And then it shows the evil in human nature, that so many people are caught up in this evil that will celebrate an organization of baby murderers. But another reason why we need to understand this, we need to look at this, we need to, I mean, it is heartbreaking to see those pictures of that little baby and to know that he's just been cruelly murdered. But we also need to see this is a taste of what's coming to the whole world if we don't repent. And that's another reason why we need to think about this.
Indeed. And the Bible actually gives some pretty concrete specifics as to what to watch for regarding everything we're seeing in Israel, everything we're seeing with the Palestinians especially. The particular verse that comes to mind is in Hosea chapter 5, verse 13, which talks about Judah, the Jews, the people of the state of Israel today, having a deadly wound, or a wound that they see and that they turn to for outside help. Like you were talking about earlier about Germany, they go to Assyria, they go to what's prophetically Germany today. And Mr. Gerald Fleury has talked about in his free booklet that we offer on thetrumpet.com, Jerusalem Prophecy, and in many other smaller articles that he's written over the years about how this wound, if you look at it, what the original Hebrew means, it means a remedy or a bandaging up, or in a sense, the remedy is the wound. And he's pointed to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process as being that wound. And for the longest time, Israel has tried very hard, no matter what the Palestinians do, they haven't really seen their wound. When you look at footage like we've put on this program a few moments ago, people are starting to wake up and see the wound. But there is still, as you mentioned, it talks a lot about society. There's still a lot of Israelis. I think one poll from the Israeli Broadcasting Authority said that a majority of Israelis approve of ceasefire negotiations continuing, even if it lets Hamas stay in power in Gaza. And it's not pleasant to think about, of course, but we're going to be seeing more and more of these kinds of atrocities happening until, and then when the majority of the public or the government or whoever does wake up to this, as he mentioned earlier, as Mr. Fleury mentioned in the Key of David, they're going to turn not to God, but to outside powers, to this militarizing Germany. But ultimately, God is, as you said, a God of justice, and he's working everything out, not just for individual murders, but he has a plan for all mankind. And he's the God that allows Satan to have power over this earth, but he's going to take that power away, and he's going to let world events develop in a certain way, not just for that to happen, but for mankind to realize why it's happening, and then finally he could start blessing mankind as he intends to.
We are going to see more atrocities like this until mankind wakes up, because it's the only way that God can get us to wake up and make the massive changes that we need to make that will cause peace and prosperity and an eternity of joy and so many wonderful things. But that's what it takes. I mean, this is Mr. Armstrong talking very directly about how these things will get worse, and we need to wake up to that. And these kind of images and this news about atrocities, I mean, we do need to hear it because we need to wake up. This is clip 11.
And I wonder, sometimes I think I'm wasting my time, my friends, to tell you these things. Wouldn't you rather be just amused and entertained? Wouldn't you rather just pass away the time, not knowing what's going to come on you? Or would you rather be warned before it happens and have a way to avoid all of this so it need not come? You can avert it. You can avoid it. You can have supernatural protection. It doesn't need to happen to you. But it's going to happen, I'm telling you. You can go on lulling yourself to sleep. You can go to the movies. You can see the crime pictures and look at it on television. You can lull yourself to sleep with pleasing things that amuse and entertain you. And you can hide the truth from yourself. But there's going to be a day of reckoning. On the other hand, you can open up your ears, and you can open your mind, and you can really begin to tremble at these things and the reality of them. They're coming from God Almighty. And you can seek the eternal, your God, with your whole heart. And you can come under His protection, and then you'll have only happiness ahead. Now it's up to you. You're going to make your decision. You're hearing the prophecies of God Almighty, and God help you to open your ears and to realize the seriousness of this thing and not to take it so lightly. Not to think, oh, well, we hear everything today. We hear any old kind of a crackpot, and we hear all kinds of fanaticism. Yes, I know you do.
And a powerful warning there that, I mean, many even that were in Mr. Armstrong's church, or the church that God led through him, have gone back to, the movies and the distraction. And we need the kind of wake-up call that we saw this week. But again, there is hope. This is leading into wonderfully positive news. And here's just one more clip from Mr. Flurry's Key of David program from October 2023.
But notice what happens right at the very end. For the Eternal will have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. And the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. Well, how about that? This is all going to lead to Jacob and Israel ruling over this earth. And you can read those verses 2 and 3 where God takes all of those fears away. And that's great news. All of these terrible things that you're seeing in this world today are leading directly into the second coming of Christ. That's the good news here. And God wants us to see that, but He wants us to see the horror show before, because we're bringing it on ourselves.
So we need to see the horror show. We need to see we're bringing it on ourselves, but we need to see where this is leading as well. And this is leading to a wonderful, incredible future when we turn from the ways that are causing evil and turn to the ways that are causing good. Well, before we finish up with the Middle East, did you have any other stories you wanted to bring us?
There's one you mentioned at the beginning that I think we'll touch up on. There were 3 buses that blew up last night in the suburb of Bat Yam, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. So thankfully nobody was injured, but the Israeli government is treating it as a terror attack, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has said he plans on escalating his war on terror in the West Bank as a result of this, which is a war against Hamas itself. A lot of people don't realize Hamas and Israel are still fighting, just not in Gaza. And this all obviously factors into everything else we're talking about with the ceasefire and with what outside actors might be doing. But yeah, it's important not to ignore that front as circumstances continue.
Thank you for that, Mihailo. Well, we've been doing a lot of talk this week about U.S. foreign policy, and there have been some foreign policy successes for the United States this week as well. And so to hear more about at least one of those, we'll go now to Andrew Miller.
Yes, I think the Trumpet World may be angling to be the first show on YouTube to admit that Donald Trump is neither pure good nor pure evil.
Yeah, I feel like we're taking a massive risk at offending all of our readers.
Yeah, at least we know our opinions are intellectually honest. We don't necessarily have a political partisan, we're taking this team or this team. We're trying to do our best to analyze the issues and see what's working and what's not in the light of Bible prophecy. I think one big foreign policy victory Trump's had this week is he's doing his best to get out of wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East and making some pretty morally compromising positions in order to do that. Although he is on closer to home, taking a very strong stance against drug trafficking in North America. One of his first actions in office was to sign an executive order saying that he was going to designate drug trafficking organizations as terrorist groups. Well, this week he followed through on that promise and actually singled out 8 specific Latin American drug cartels: the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, the Gulf cartel, the Northeast cartel, the La Nueva family, Michoacana cartel, the United cartel, Tren de Argula, and Mara Salvatrucha. I think I mispronounced the last one, but on at least those 8 cartels actually now being, in the eyes of the U.S. State Department, official terrorist agencies, which puts more options on the table for how you're going to deal with those. Like normally, you're not normally allowed to invade another country to take care of a street gang in that country. And both Elon Musk and Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, have highlighted that what this decision does is it basically opens the door for U.S. drone strikes on Mexican cartels.
And I think certainly when we look at the capability of these groups, they warrant that. Clearly, these are way more dangerous than a bunch of criminals running around with knives and handguns. Like, they are armed to the degree that they're probably more capable than many armies around the world. This is the kind of force that you need if you're going to get to grips with the problem.
Right, because by our best estimates, the cartels of these 8 cartels control about 40% of Mexico. The amount of money they're making from the drug trade is in the billions. So they're well equipped with their own armies. They may not be ideologically using terrorist techniques like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, but their level of brutality is definitely intended to terrorize. Like if you've got a Mexican police officer who's trying to crack down on drug trafficking in his district, they don't just kill him, but they like behead him or boil him in acid or do something that basically sends a message to other police officers that if you get on our bad side, this is going to happen to you, or blackmail the family. And so it's very clear that even though the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, does not want American drone strikes or American intervention in her country, it's very clear that the Mexican government is not equipped to handle the problem. Even you're looking at just the United States, the death toll. We're not suffering from quite the same level of gang warfare as Mexico is. But I just put together a small graphic for the World Watch of our next issue of the print edition of the Trumpet, showing that last year, 73,000 people in the United States died from fentanyl overdose. I think if you start including heroin and cocaine and stuff like that, and drug-related deaths, whether by drug-related gang violence or overdose deaths together, is now, I believe it's the leading cause of death in the United States for those under age 50.
I think that's a really powerful point about the terror tactics that they use, about the mass amount of death and suffering that this causes. And I think, good for Donald Trump, good for President Trump for upholding the law here and trying to get to grips with this. But also at the heart of this is a moral crisis, and is the fact that we failed to uphold the law when it comes to illegal drug taking. And basically, America's basically given up on the war on drugs. Drugs won. And so it seems like these measures could have some success for a time. But while the demand for drugs is still there, while you have immoral lifestyles and hopeless lives, so that people en masse go for these kind of addictions and escapism, you're going to have the potential for this kind of violence. And that fits right in with what we're expecting with Bible prophecy, where, I mean, we don't know how successful Donald Trump is going to be with this war on drugs, but ultimately the solution is repentance. The solution is turning away from a society that consumes drugs en masse and blotting out all of this money that's going to these different evil organizations. And if we don't do that, yeah, you can kind of tamp down on things by enforcing the law, and things will get much better if you enforce the law. But once that's taken away, if America lacks that will again or lacks the capacity to do that, these can flare right back up into violence. And the Bible has some very specific prophecies about violence in America's cities.
Right, because I was gonna say even more generally, I mean that's the big thing you don't hear Donald Trump and others talk about is the spiritual dimension to this. They're trying to crack down on the supply of drugs, uh, and hoping that if they make drugs harder to get, fewer people will use them. And that might work to some extent if, as drugs get harder to get, you crack down on cartels, they get more expensive. There might be some young people who never get involved in that in the beginning. But ultimately, it's never going to completely solve the problem because there's a spiritual problem that's causing people to take the drugs in the first place. So we already see the mass violence in Mexico, and it's getting worse in the United States. The other Old Testament scripture I brought with me today was Ezekiel 5 and verse 12 that actually, and this is about end time America and Britain, the end time nations of Israel, talking about like the end punishment for turning away from God is a third of the nation dies in pestilence and famine, then a third of the nation by the sword, and then a third of the nation into slavery. In the Ezekiel, the End Time Prophet booklet, our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Flory, has really talking about that. First third is talking about like race riots and crime, like Civil War style violence. And then that second third's a military invasion by the Holy Roman Empire, and the third goes into slavery. And so it's really hard to wrap your mind around that, like a third of the people, like 100 million people, dying in like race riots and civil war-like conditions. But then when you look at what's happening in Mexico, it starts to become more realistic. It's not a third of Mexico, but I mean, I didn't look at the statistics for this year, but I know back when a couple years ago when the Syrian civil war was going really bad, the death toll in Mexico was actually worse than that. Because of this drug crime. He's definitely wise to recognize this is a problem. He should be doing more like what Ronald Reagan or Abraham Lincoln would have done and actually start talking to the people about like, well, you need to be better with your child rearing and better with your family life to cut down on the supply. That's the side of the equation he's missing. But just because he's missing the side of the equation, he is still right to say that. And while we're trying to cut down on the supply, like we should be taking firm action to enforce the law.
So some potential good news there, but it needs more and deeper repentance to really turn the problem around. And that's where the Bible warns that in the long run, things will get worse unless we do that. And of course, all of these problems, all of these crises, they're all there to point us to repentance and to stir us to repent and live the way of life that brings in hope and joy and all of the good things. But you had a few other pieces of news to bring us from the English-speaking world this week.
Yes, yeah, a few other stories. I think about like 2 or 3 more stories from America, and then a couple from Australia and New Zealand as well. So some more good news in America is Kash Patel was confirmed as FBI director this week. He's taking a strong stance. Kash Patel, for those who don't know, he was a veteran of Donald Trump's first administration who helped draft the Nunes memo, which really exposed the Russia collusion scandal. A lot of Democrats did not want him as FBI director because he's famous for exposing corruption in the FBI. And so that's a positive development. It's like now that he's the director of the FBI, a lot more of that corruption is very likely to be exposed. Elon Musk and the Doge department continue to make progress in America. After he revealed that there's actually millions of people in America listed in the Social Security database who are older than 100 years old. And quite a few of them who are older than 150, a handful of them who are older than 200, and I think even one guy who is 360 years old. The top official at Social Security basically decided to just resign before Musk breaks this open, which is my last story. Actually looks like it's one story. It's both Australia and New Zealand, two other English-speaking countries in the world, were really alarmed this week when a group of Chinese naval vessels, including a pretty formidable warship, sailed through the Tazan Sea. I don't think it was an illegal breach of waters, but it's definitely China flexing its muscles, sending like a big armada into waters really close to Australia and New Zealand, just trying to show the world that it considers those waters in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean and related seas as Chinese territory, trying to take over more sea gates, exert more naval dominance. Australia's kind of woken up to that a little bit recently, because I've seen them be taking a number of moves to try to make defense agreements with some of these islands throughout Oceania in order to try to counter China. But they're so far they seem to be fighting a losing battle, as that is one segment of the world where Chinese dominance is just really growing by leaps and bounds every day.
Well, thank you very much for that, Andrew. Well, we've talked about terrorism. We've had a couple of pretty disturbing stories on today's show. So I wanted to conclude with one more segment from Mr. Armstrong, talking about the cause and the solution in quite a profound way of terrorism and many of these other problems, and pointing to the ultimate hope. This is clip 8.
Nation doesn't love other nations, they love their own nation. And so we have competition, and that leads often to war, and individuals come to what you're having here right now. The kind of violence has come into terrorism. And terrorism comes in the same way as war, from a wrong attitude of mind, a wrong desire of just selfishness and of opposition toward other people, and wanting to use force of some kind to have your own way against other people. I don't have a magic wand. I can't wave a magic wand and just say the world has peace. You can't bring it about that way. I have to look at the facts as they are. And the facts are human nature.
But I feel what you have just said is only philosophy and does not offer any solution to our problems. How will that produce peace now?
It won't produce peace now. I'm just telling you the facts, that what will produce peace. And I say to you that we human beings are not going to produce peace. I think that all religions, at least, know that there is a higher power. Many of them don't know what that higher power is. They don't have it defined, perhaps, because they don't know. But there is a higher power, and that higher power is going to have to come and bring us peace. We're not going to bring peace, but the great Creator, God, is going to have to intervene and bring us peace if He has to force it upon us. And that's the way peace is finally going to come.
And that's what all of these news events that we've been talking about this week are leading to. Well, thank you so much for joining us. You can get in touch with the show at Trumpet World at thetrumpet.com. If you go to our website, thetrumpet.com as well, you can get all of those different books and booklets and articles that we've mentioned, and we'll put links to everything we've mentioned down into the show notes. Thank you so much to George Haddad and Isaac Lorenz for engineering and production. We'll be back on our Wednesday show, where I think at the very least we will devote part of the show to giving you an update on what's happened with those German elections. So keep watching those this weekend. And until then, keep watching your world.